Good morning. Thank you for joining Marianne and the professor. This morning, I am happily joined with or by Dr. Roger Hodkinson, who is in Alberta. And I am so delighted to have you here with me today. Roger, thank you for taking the time.
It's my pleasure. We need to get this message out as far and wide.
So Dr. Hodkinson, you are one of the earliest whistleblowers in Canada. I absolutely delighted when I saw you come forward, it must be 2 years ago, and pronounce that there was a major issue, a major scam happening. Now, if I jump to the present, what is the most important event in the last month, would you say? There's a lot of things happening currently. What is the big issue in your mind, or what's the big event?
Well, the edifice is crumbling internationally, of course, led by the so-called mea culpa of Walensky at the CDC. That comes as close to, saying we screwed everything up as you could possibly imagine. There's now the big, finger pointing going on, which is delicious to watch. They'll consume each other. And of course, Fauci has decided to quit before the hounds come after him. So, yeah, I mean, you couldn't find better evidence of how imagined this whole thing was from the bureaucrats' perspective. There was no science behind it of any type for anything. Anything that they've done failed. Everything they did failed.
Right.
Because the science was never there in the first place, whether you're talking about masks, social distancing, testing, mandates, vaccination, so-called, etc. It's the biggest calamity in medicine's history ever to have something of this scale undertaken for no reason, with catastrophic consequences because of the rushed way things were done.
Are you of the mind that this was intentional or accidental?
I'm not a conspiracy theorist at all. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. At least I was not previously an anti-vaxxer. I took all the vaccines myself, including the flu, pneumococcal, etc. What this recent discovery of CDC's complicity and FDA's complicity in what has happened, what that has unfortunately created, I believe, is a catastrophic loss of trust in organizations that were previously relied upon by medicine for guidance and the truth, you might say, about all kinds of medications and regulatory processes. Because when trust goes out of the window, we're all alone. It's divisive. Trust is the cement that keeps society together. And so, whereas I was previously most definitely not an anti-vaxxer, as a matter of fact, I view with great suspicion Kennedy's autism project. But now I have to eat humble pie. I'm saying publicly, on air, what medicines, if any, can we trust? What vaccines, if any, can we trust? Because the very body that said they were safe and effective has now been shown to be a liar. Criminally corrupt organization, which is used to be the bedrock of medicine. The body that gave the green light for medications to be used in pregnant women, for example. Pregnant women are the most precious asset in society, the most protected asset in society. And in medicine, we never, ever contemplate giving a pregnant woman anything that's remotely dangerous because of the experience with thalidomide. It's as if we're repeating that story all over again, haven't learned from history. So when there's so much loss of trust with so many serious long-term consequences, it's not just a tragic day for medicine. It's a tragic day for the world.
Well, so we see things very clearly in terms of the deception, but what is it that other Canadians are not seeing, the reality of what is going on? I mean, the media certainly has distorted reality, but what do you think is the rationale behind the blindness of Canadians?
It's the Machiavellian efficiency of the federal government and the WHO to constantly feed a stream of lies that has been protected from discovery because of the intimidation and corruption of organizations that should have been standing up and saying the opposite. Not just medicine, corrupt colleges of physicians and surgeons, who I'm saying publicly now are co-conspirators with government in state-sanctioned murder. The very body that's supposed to protect you from us is now killing you. That is not the way it's supposed to be. But it's not just medicine. Look at the media. Boy Blunder has fed billions of dollars into the media to keep them quiet. A failing industry understands that. You don't bite the hand that feeds you. Mm-hmm. Where's the church in all of this, other than a handful of pastors who were brave and went to jail for standing up? Where's the church? I say this, the church leaders could be found peeing behind their pulpits, not leading their flock when they were desperate for leadership. Because whenever the unified state, the church, whenever the unified church takes on the state, the church is guaranteed to win. Mm-hmm. They chose to abrogate that responsibility and that potential power, leaving their congregations adrift. Despicable at all levels. So you have all the usual sources of information corrupt or intimidated by this Machiavellian strategy of the federal and provincial governments to simply deny access to any counter-narrative. Physicians, one of the principal ethics in medicine that was drummed into me is informed consent. Tell me, how can you have informed consent if you are not informed?
That's right.
By the intentional suppression of information by these colleges who dress it up as guidelines, but they're actually diktats. Mm-hmm. If you don't follow the guideline, as they call it, we're going to take away your livelihood. Well, sadly, most physicians have put their pocketbook ahead of society. When I trained in medicine, it was to do the public good. I'm not trying to dress myself in the flag here and be self-righteous, not at all. Mm-hmm. When that DR title is conferred on you, it implies that you are probably the most trustworthy source of information in society. When that door's closed and you have a confidential conversation, you used to be able to trust your doctor to tell you the truth. So if you're going to see a doctor a month from now with bellyache that could be cancer, and he does the investigations and he tells you that you're fine, are you going to believe that physician when a month prior to that, he or she had looked you straight in the eye and told you that this stuff was safe?
Well, do you think
trust goes out of the window?
Do you think doctors know the truth and are withholding it, or do you think a lot of them are completely unaware and have drunk the Kool-Aid?
There's certainly both groups out there. Mm-hmm. Those that are choosing to stay ignorant because they think it's their ultimate defense. I didn't know. That didn't prove very successful at Nuremberg, did it? Yeah, but there's also a large number of physicians out there who are acutely aware of the scale of what's going on, but are putting their pocketbooks before their patients. Yeah. Medicine has changed dramatically. It's not the profession I joined, and I'm glad I'm no longer active in it. I still have my permit, as they call it. used to be a license. We're now no better than a plumber, to be regulated out of existence.
Well,
you see, just let me say one more thing. Standard of care is a legal concept that you would lose your license for if you didn't follow the standard of care repeatedly. But it's going beyond standard of care now. It's standardized care. Mm-hmm. It's the government that is your new doctor. And I say to that, be worried, be very worried, because you've just seen what happens when your government is your new doctor. They are not looking after your interest. They are quite prepared to kill you and get away with it.
Well, and it doesn't even feel as though our government is our new doctor. It feels like the WHO has, designated themselves as the doctors for the world. But unfortunately, they're not a credible body. They're privately funded. So we have a body that's usurping control from national systems.
Right.
Did you ever imagine that you would see this?
Not at all. It's been a creep, an intentional creep. Evolutionary steps of control. Mm-hmm. That you wake up one morning and you find that you've almost lost the game. Thank God for the truckers. They stood up, and, yes, with a point of the spear sticking at Trudeau's belly, and thank God for the truckers. It obviously morphed into much bigger things than that, but they started it right here in Alberta. It started. Mm-hmm. It morphed internationally, and now, having been an observer of this over the last 2.5 years, I'll tell you very frankly. In Ottawa, I was a flag-waving patriot. I held the flag. That's what I was there to do, to try to knock some sense into these clowns that are pretending to be physicians. But I've changed. I've changed dramatically. I'm not a patriot anymore. For the first time 2 weeks ago, I sat down for the national anthem. I will never, ever wave the Canadian flag again unless I'm waving it upside down. This country has changed dramatically, because of wokeism having infiltrated every level of organization, not just politics. And so the only way to change that, frankly, is not to plead with Ottawa and beg for change. No, that's going to fail. They ride roughshod over anyone that objects to anything. Mm-hmm. The evidence is totally clear. Mm-hmm. This infatuation with the green agenda, Clydesdales trampling old women on scooters. I mean, it knows no end. The hypocrisy, the determination to transform this country into the first post-national state, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it's just a second. We can't move the needle in Ottawa. Mm-hmm. It's fatuous to think we would get anything other than crumbs thrown our way. Mm-hmm. So that's why I'm all in for the independent Republic of Alberta, because having self-determination means one singular thing, quite apart from being happy and prosperous and free. It means you have control over the governance of these out-of-control organizations, like the health services, like the police, like the courts, like the College of Physicians. Suddenly you have the power of governance to trash those organizations, burn them down to the studs, as Paul Alexander says, for the CDC, mm-hmm. and reinvent them in a way that's consistent with the original principles of democracy that we're all so very familiar with, which have been uniformly trashed. Family, religion, hard work, risk-taking, trust, etc. Those fundamental principles need to be reborn. And so what I'm thinking is going to happen, Marianne, over the next couple of years, or less, a year perhaps, is that with the growing evidence of carnage on a most catastrophic scale, certainly from the so-called vaccine, the clock shot, as I prefer to call it, and the mandates. When that starts being quantified by investigative journalists and the basement printing press gets going, lay language, bullet format, quick read, when the lay public start becoming aware of the scale at which they have had their rights trampled on and the serious consequences which have touched just about everyone on earth, I think that's going to create a scale of revulsion that we're not quite prepared for. Mm-hmm. And that will be something, taking a leaf out of the Great Resetters book, right? They took massive advantage of an unexpected opportunity. I don't believe it was genocide planned at all. I believe this was unexpected, but an incredible opportunity that they took immediate, planned advantage of. Now we can take a leaf out of their book. We got their number. That's how you do things these days. You get an unexpected opportunity and you milk it to hell. Well, that's exactly what we're going to do now. This revulsion that I believe is going to come out of every investigative journalist is going to be on this. That becomes the feedstock for things such as the Independent Republic of Alberta. The scale of anger in rural Alberta, you can cut with a knife. I've been out there at dozens of rallies. Edmonton and Calgary are next. And if they can be persuaded to sign off on this referendum that we're proposing for independence, that starts the ball rolling. And it can't come too soon, because Ottawa has its sights on destroying not just Alberta, but Canada.
Yes. Do you feel that there's this resistance movement in Saskatchewan where they are?
Certainly. As a matter of fact, we had the first meeting in Swift Current a couple of months ago. Mm-hmm. And mm-hmm. there is a movement starting now in Saskatchewan, modeled largely on the structure of what's going on in Alberta, which, by the way, it's not an independent party. It's not a political party at all. Mm-hmm. There's a party that is pushing that, the Independence Party. But the Alberta Prosperity Project is a society, not a party, that is intent upon one thing and one thing only, and that is to educate the population on the gravity of what's going on, not just in medicine, but in the economy and politics and law and policing, etc. Yeah. And then using that educational process to drive a referendum that will be thundering in its implications. We're looking for 1 million+ signatures that will not be ignored by whoever the premier turns out to be.
So essentially, you are looking, this reminds me of the 10th Amendment in the US, where you break off, states have the ability to break off from the federal government and claim autonomy. Right. But our Constitution doesn't allow that, but this is forcing it, saying we no longer
I'm sorry.
Part of this game.
I'm sorry to correct you there, but the Clarity Act has made it very clear mm-hmm. what boxes you have to tick in order to become independent. That came out of the failed Quebec referendum. Okay. And the Supreme Court essentially drafted those criteria in what's called the Clarity Act. And that is what you have to follow. No one's proposing an insurrection here or anything that's violent at all. Make that be perfectly clear. Mm-hmm. We want to stay within the parameters of established democratic principles, the laws that are already out there that we intend to follow, and achieve success in a non-violent way.
That's very interesting. I've learned something then. So the Clarity Act provides kind of a structure with which to proceed. And essentially you're following that.
And that's exactly why the Act was written, mm-hmm. was to provide that guidance for the future, having seen such a narrow loss narrow win, you might say, in Quebec, that there needed to be some clarity for the future, which was the precise purpose of the Clarity Act.
Well, this is very exciting news, because I I think there is no fixing. The federal government is corrupt, complicit in a level of crime that is unfathomable. And they've sold themselves to these globalists who really have an agenda. So I don't see much hope going forward for Canada. I do think what you're referring to has the best likelihood of success.
Let me make a very positive statement. Before I'm going to make a negative statement first, but it is going to get worse before it gets better. The nonsense is going to continue in the fall. It could be catastrophic, actually. An understaffed, low morale healthcare service, under-equipped, understaffed. People are being fired, resigned. People with inferior qualifications are being brought in to fill the gaps. Bums in seats are not the way you run a healthcare system. That is already under stress. We're going to enter the typical fall season with pneumonia, the flu, etc. We're also seeing, quite likely, an increase in the rate of infections of those who have been vaccinated, superimposed upon that traditional stress in the fall of an understaffed system. And then on top of that, we have what appears to be an emergence of a large number of new cancers or old cancers that we thought were under control. Again, not quantified because they just don't want to know. So we have the stats coming out that I'm sure you've seen, a sudden adult death syndrome. Unexplained deaths are now the commonest cause of death in Alberta. Now that's the canary.
No one's connecting the dots, saying
that
all
is
people are vaccinated.
That is the canary in the coal mine.
Yes.
Because you would multiply that by at least a factor of 10 for disability that did not result in death due to the same thing, namely the clot shot. So come the fall, even if there's no reimposition of these ridiculous mandates, masks and quarantine and so on, the system could totally decompensate.
Yes.
So it's going to get worse. But the optimistic thing is that this concept of an independent Republic of Alberta is doable within 3 years. Very practical plan has been laid out. This isn't just a pie in the sky wish list. No, this has been thoroughly researched and documented with policy and governance and all kinds of funding that is in the wings to further this wonderful adventure in Alberta. But when we succeed, it won't just be the happiest, freest, most prosperous place on earth, but it will be a beacon for the rest of the world as to how to redefine democracy, starting right here, of all places, in Alberta, as a beacon for the rest of the world. That's why I'm calling this, the potential for this, it sounds grandiose, but I think there's ample reason to support it. This is actually Magna Carta II underway, as we are speaking now. When those barons walked down the meadow at Runnymede to face King John, they did not know if they were going to come back alive. They wrestled rights from the king that morphed into what we now call democratic government. Those rights were progressively whittled away, particularly in the last couple of decades. And so now we have the opportunity of retaking democracy in its original form. And calling it Magna Carta II is not an understatement because of the gravity of the dystopian future that awaits us if we do nothing. Losing is not an option. This is the hill to die on for everyone if you're remotely concerned about not just the future of democracy in general, but the future for your children.
So what is the sentiment in Alberta then, in terms of, because in the past there's been a group who will go protest. There's a group that are fighting the legal battles. There's all the non-compliance. Do you notice a shift in the province of Alberta where people are redirecting their energy towards separating?
It's massive.
Really? That's very
I've been out there
mm-hmm.
at dozens of rallies in rural Alberta. Now, to a certain extent, we're preaching to the choir, of course. Yeah. But you can cut the anger, as I said, with a knife.
Mm-hmm.
It is vehement, intolerant. Change is being demanded. Enough is being screamed. This isn't just a rambunctious group of disorganized people mm-hmm. who are sort of radical in their thinking and obviously to be dismissed immediately. No, these are very ordinary people. Farmers, no, not a radical amongst them.
Well, I actually think
they've just had it.
They've had it. Well, I think a lot of people in the interior BC would like to join with you, because there's a huge, how would I say, division between the urbanites in Vancouver right. and the rural BC population. Right. They would love to be on board with you as well. And so what do you foresee happening if rural BC or Saskatchewan wants to join up? Do you envision that there could be an amalgamation?
Well, I'm not on the board of the APP. I'm strictly staying in my box, talking about all this medical catastrophe that's going on. But from what I understand, the sentiment in Saskatchewan is identical to Alberta. Mm-hmm. We will do our own thing here, and if Saskatchewan comes along a little bit later, mm-hmm. certainly merging would be a very practical solution. Mm-hmm. Northeastern BC is similarly of the same opinion. How that would translate into carving off northern BC with access to port at Prince Rupert, I can't speak to that. All I can tell you is, but I know, which is Alberta, this is a rapidly growing movement, mm-hmm. grassroots. Mm-hmm. There are now 140 chapters across Alberta, each with its own cohort of volunteers. It's grown so big that there are now regional coordinators for this across the province. The hard nuts of Calgary and Edmonton will be more vigorously approached in the fall. That will require significant funding. Mm-hmm. There has been a signed contract between the APP and Rebel News. This is totally on side with the objectives of separation with Alberta. All these things are now coming together, mm-hmm. and it's going to be run differently from Quebec. We have the advantage now of the Clarity Act as the guidepost for how to do it. And it is going to happen. In 3 years, there will be an independent Republic of Alberta.
Very interesting. I do envision the future is highly decentralized. So this fits with that notion of we need to get back to a decentralized model where there's accountability and regional control. And we've lost our way in Canada. Well, especially in the West here, we don't feel that we have any say in what happens federally. So I think people are already disenchanted in the West.
Well, the way federalism works in this country is that the provinces actually have a constitutional right to administer many aspects of government, mm-hmm. Policing, healthcare, education, for example, mm-hmm. Taxation, even. Collection. That is within the power of whoever is the new Premier of Alberta, given the leadership race that's going on right now. Capturing those essential elements that are ingrained in the Constitution, capturing control of those elements from Ottawa is a stealth attack on independence, because then the actual final move of separating is going to be so much smoother, mm-hmm. because we would already be running our police force, already running our healthcare system differently. with quite likely a private element to it, which is, of course, like the rest of the world, with the singular exception of Canada. So many elements can be introduced by the new Premier of Alberta, making the transition into independence that much smoother.
Mm-hmm. So you envision the Premier facilitating this process?
Well, it was very interesting 2 nights ago, listening to the front runner, Danielle Smith, say, as a result of a pointed question, that she will essentially decapitate Alberta Health Services and the College of Physicians and Surgeons because of having control over their governance. And I'd like to think that the universities are next, because if you had to point one finger at why we're in this global mess, in my opinion, it all started and has been reinforced over decades by the universities, a self-perpetuating elite that cranks out people in the same mold of socialist thinking. They are spat out and become teachers and lawyers and doctors and politicians, right? But the point is that they kick out teachers who then reinforce that message in the schools. Mm-hmm. So the students get the message in the schools because the teachers learned it in the university. Mm-hmm. Then they get a second dose at university, and they naturally think, well, obviously I've heard it twice now, that must be right. And if you want to proceed in this society, you better agree. So the universities, in my opinion, are the root cause of wokeism, not just in Alberta, but internationally.
Absolutely.
They need to have their wings clipped. Yeah. Because they are at the public trough. They will, of course, howl blue murder that this is the ultimate restraint of freedom and freedom of speech, while they themselves are the cause of it. Exactly. If there's anything to learn from recent politics in the States, with the Democrats attacking Trump and so on, the Russian hoax, you can almost be guaranteed now that any organizational attack on you is because they are doing exactly that and are trying to cover their tracks. So the universities at the public trough are the ultimate cause of the mess that we're in, and they have to be brought to heel forcibly. And it's very simple. It's called the spigot. You turn the money off.
Well, and they are the spokesperson or the puppets for industry, for big pharma, right, for the corporate world.
Right.
The funding that is directed to them to essentially give a narrative that right, the corporate world desires is right. The corruption right. is massive. And I do agree. It's almost like we need to start from scratch.
There was a survey done in California, which admittedly is probably a bit skewed, but essentially it was a survey of the political leanings of junior faculty mm-hmm. in universities in California. 90% of junior faculty in California are rampant socialists, bordering on closet communists. Those are the people that are now calling the shots with the deans of their various departments. They are a force that's been encouraged, and they are now running, it's the junior faculty that's now running universities. And let's not forget here, just a final soapbox comment. Universities are not there to educate. Universities are there as a business to get money to support departmental research, which is largely useless. If you're not publishing, you're fired. That's the operating mode of a university. Mm-hmm. The students are merely the necessary bums in seats to pay the fees mm-hmm. to keep the whole thing rolling. The students are utterly irrelevant. It's a business model. And so they're cranking out all these students with ridiculous fees that can't be justified, especially in the States. And not responding really to society's needs, simply their own business needs.
Mm-hmm.
So my advice to anyone these days contemplating university degree is forget it. Forget it.
Yeah, it almost has become irrelevant. I think a lot of students are beginning to see that
learn a trade.
The benefits. I think they do feel as though they're funding the corruption in a sense. Their tuition fees are nothing more than that.
Learn a trade. Set up your own company. Become an entrepreneur. Take control. With one singular piece of advice, read my lips. Do not have a partner.
Yeah, stay independent and mentor under great business people or professionals. That whole European style of mentoring and apprentice is.
No, you see, an independent Republic of Alberta would have governance control of the university.
Mm-hmm.
They could have their heads cut off as well. What did we see as a classic example of that, as if you need to document how corrupt they are and how determined they are to controlling their merry path of destroying society? Where did the ex-fired head of Alberta Health Services find a soft landing very quickly? Guess where she ended up? As provost of the University of Alberta. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
It's a perfect place.
What's give you another interesting statistic here. We all surmise that senior bureaucrats are socialist in their thinking.
Mm-hmm.
It's an easy job. It's got a pension. It's protected, you know, di-da. It's the classic landing spot for a socialist who's at the trough, right? No risk involved, just guaranteed income.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's just supposition. So I looked at the only jurisdiction in the world where there's a tight geographic population of bureaucrats, not diluted by people running ordinary lives. And the only place on earth that you could think of that represents that is Washington, D.C. Intensely, it's all government there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So guess what the voting pattern was in the last federal election in the States, in Washington, D.C.? You're going to be surprised with this number. 90% of the votes cast were for Biden. Do you have to say anything more about the deep state and the swamp?
Exactly. So this movement in Alberta, who are the big names behind it? And are there more big names joining the fight? Can you divulge who's behind it, or are they quite clandestine in their operations?
Sure. No, it's public knowledge. The Alberta Prosperity Project is the product of the Alberta Prosperity Society, which is a publicly listed organization with its own board of directors.
Mm-hmm.
CEO is a senior retired cardiovascular surgeon with deep connections in political history in Alberta and corporate finance.
Mm-hmm.
His name is Dr. Dennis Modry, Modry,
mm-hmm.
a wonderful man. The idea was his. He has crafted an incredible platform, which is there for everyone to see if they want to log on to the Alberta Prosperity Project. It has, as I said earlier, a very powerful relationship now with Rebel News that is totally on side with the objectives of an independent Republic of Alberta.
What about the Oilmen's Club or the oil and gas sector, the leaders in that sector? I would imagine they would be quite keen to get back to doing their business.
Yes, you'd like. I can't speak to it because I'm not on the board. I don't know what.
Because that to me is a very important group to get on side.
Yes, but remember, they've all been mealy-mouthed about Ottawa.
Yeah.
They recognize that their thinking would be something like this. Let's say this movement that I throw my full weight behind as Chevron or Esso or whatever. let's say this fails. What's the reaction of Ottawa going to be? Is it going to be even worse than it is now? So in the C-suite of these multinationals, wokeism is alive and well. Mm-hmm. Do not think for a minute that they're looking out for you. No, they're looking out for their company. Mm-hmm. And they're making pragmatic business decisions on a risk analysis basis. So you can't necessarily look for the obvious sources of support because they have their own agenda.
So the Alberta Prosperity Project primarily is the engine behind it is a medical community or more of a business community?
No, not at all. Not at all. Mm-hmm. It's certainly not medical and it's certainly not business. It's literally a massive grassroots movement.
Right.
With entirely ordinary people who are indignant and intolerant and are screaming, enough.
Yes.
These are not radicals. They're not wackos. They're thinking people who have read the tea leaves that any negotiation with Ottawa to change the landscape is fatuous. It will not happen. It's been tried and failed repeatedly.
Yeah, there's a futility. There is a futility. I agree with you. And the fact that this is grassroots, it sounds very broad, very diverse group of members. This is very good. This is very good. And it may be a lot of retirees who are seasoned and feel the freedom to speak out. They don't have as much to lose. They're not looking over their shoulder. So
come the fall, watch carefully. This is a movement that is growing rapidly. It's not plateaued. It's just the opposite.
Yes.
We're into the summer. People are finally relieved that they can live a relatively normal life, even though they still can't leave the country and come back easily. Still prisoners in their own country, but people are under the false sense of security that just because they don't have to have masks, that everything's fine. Thank you very much. And it's now summer, the sun's shining, and we want to enjoy ourselves. Thank you very much. Mm-hmm. But that's natural, that relief from oppression. Complacency is the danger, of course, now. Mm-hmm. But come the fall, when they start turning the screws again, the Alberta Prosperity Project is looking for cracking Edmonton and Calgary and give activists 1 million signatures on a referendum that is demanding that the Premier negotiates on these terms with Ottawa, recognizing that is guaranteed to fail, following which there's going to be a ribbon around the whole thing. This is non-negotiable, not a piecemeal dissection. No, it's all or nothing.
All or none.
And they will return with nothing, which is the predicate for declaring independence as per the Clarity Act.
Well, this has been very interesting indeed. I have not heard anything about this, so I'm really glad that we spoke. Now, I would like to switch gears completely and ask you on a few other issues. And this will, I think this will be part 2 of our chat today. There is constant debate about whether this virus exists. I find it intriguing that it keeps coming up. It almost feels like a little bit of a psyop. Do you have any response to this whole debate?
That's nonsense. The virus exists most definitively.
Tell me why, in your experience. You own labs. You're a scientist and a physician and a businessman. Tell me, in a nutshell, why?
From multiple sources. It's been seen microscopically by electron microscopy. It's been sequenced in terms of its DNA structure. We know from animal experiments it's an infectious agent. Mm-hmm. It's been characterized to the hilt to a greater degree than any other virus in history, including HIV. We know more about this virus than we do just about any other infectious agent that's ever been studied by medicine. Anyone that's saying the virus doesn't exist is simply spreading a malicious rumor Look, in this business of trying to find change and get out a narrative which is counter to the idiocy that's currently out there, it's so important that we stick to the facts.
Mm-hmm.
Because any statement about snake venom, graphene oxide, magnetism, this and that, the fact checkers are going to latch onto that, destroy you in public, and ignore all the other facts that are incontrovertible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we need to stick to the facts, stick to our knitting.
Mm-hmm.
Put blinkers on and ignore all these ridiculous theories that are circulating, such as that.
Now, are you of the mindset now that Fauci was complicit in working with the Wuhan lab, and it probably has come out from that? I mean, yesterday I saw an interview with Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, who headed the committee on investigating this, and he's come out and even acknowledged, yes, this did come from Wuhan. Did it escape or was it intentional? We don't know. But there seems to be agreement on that issue that it has come out of a lab. Do you agree? Or do
Absolutely.
You have on that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. It was an accidental release. Look, we're now 2.5 years into the game, and the retrospectoscope, mm-hmm. the looking backward machine, is in full flood. Mm-hmm. No one could have guessed, even scientifically, that what they were playing around with in that lab could have all these devastating consequences. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Much of which, of course, has been the reaction to it, as opposed to the virus itself. No one could have guessed that. No. This was the failed little man syndrome, Fauci, who'd never had a meaningful, massive hit in his entire career. The HIV vaccine was a flop, and he was looking for glory. So when this thing escaped accidentally on a pair of dirty shoes, look, you can never make, I've run big labs, you can never make a lab hermetically sealed because it has a thing called people working in it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And mistakes happen. Mm-hmm. It got out accidentally. So, but the point is, you had the fair little man looking for glory at the end of his career with all the money at his disposal and the power mm-hmm. of NIH.
Yes.
You had him pitching to a narcissist. I'm a Trumper, solid, but everything he did with COVID was dead wrong, simply because Fauci and Birx lied to Trump to convince him that, Trump could have glory here too, It was a marriage made in heaven. The failed little man looking for glory, pitching to a narcissist, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, what Fauci knew and Trump did not know was that the delivery vehicle for this so-called vaccine, the nanoparticles, had been perfected over 10 years. It was ready to go.
In Canada, right?
It was the patent sold by a company in Vancouver. But the point, and Robert Malone was part of that way back in time, it was a delivery vehicle intended for other purposes, such as delivering chemotherapy to the brain, mm-hmm. because these particles pass the blood-brain barrier, just by the way as they pass the placental barrier. Mm-hmm. So the nanoparticles were ready to go. All that you had to do was to package them with mRNA of a special kind. Mm-hmm. And that everyone knows that could be done very quickly. And so Fauci knew that the so-called 6-month warp speed program was very doable, providing you didn't have the inconvenience of doing clinical trials. And so he pitched this to Trump, not knowing anything about clinical trials except just looking for glory. And the two were in lockstep. We know that from Paul Alexander, who was right there in the middle of it, seeing it evolve along those lines. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so if Trump doesn't put his standard in the ground and distance himself from Fauci and say on day one in 24, if he's still around, he's going to be gone. Instead of that, he's going through the bravado of being on television, seeing him himself get a booster. Now, you don't do that, because PR 101 is, if you've screwed up, fess up contritely as soon as possible. And if you do that in a contrite way, people will forgive you. If he does not do that, the Democrats, in my opinion, are going to throw it at his feet in 24. And despite everything that's happening with the economy and immigration, et cetera, that could be the reason he loses the second election. Because remember, he lost the first election because of COVID. It was the Democrats who realized that we could use the imagined danger of in-person voting. They realized that if they could get absentee ballots in a large scale on the basis that it's too dangerous to vote in person, they knew that they could fraudulently milk absentee ballots, which they did. Mm-hmm. Trump lost the last election because of COVID, because the Democrats milked absentee ballots. He could lose the election in 24 because of COVID for a different reason. Mm-hmm. And the reason that's important is that it's not Trump losing an election. It's not just the idiots that are currently in power in Washington, D.C., destroying America. But another 4 years of the Dumbocrats could destroy democracy globally. Mm-hmm. They're the last holdout for democracy. Europe's gone. Europe's gone. Canada's gone. If America goes, watch out.
Yeah.
We're all in deep trouble.
There is that sense that the US is the last bastion of hope for the world. So right. We're watching with trepidation what happens in the US, but it's...
So let's get an independent Republic of Alberta going to show the rest of the world there's a different way of doing things.
Yeah. Well, is this going to be similar to what's happening in Texas and Florida?
I know there are nascent movements out there for the same thing, but I can't speak to the details. Yeah.
They certainly have extracted themselves politically from the federal government, and it seems to be going well for them. But we'll see. We'll see how that plays out. On a completely different note, did you see or did you hear Dr. Peter Breggin come out in the last week talking about mass formation and dismissing it and saying Matthias Desmet has a theory that he does not feel is valid in this situation? Did you hear Peter Breggin's comments? No,
I don't listen to a damn thing he says. I think it's the other way around.
Because he feels that this is a response that he feels in Canada, we're experiencing, or in the US, authoritarian.
No, it's the other way around. It's Breggin that's the idiot. He believes in a grand conspiracy and causing all of this, which is absolute nonsense. Show me the forensic audit. It's all very well to have the dots out there. Yeah, we all know the statements of Gates on too many people on Earth and all that. We know all of that. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. But show me the forensic audit. It doesn't exist. It's mere conjecture.
Very interesting. Well, you know what? This has been a very interesting conversation. I am so glad that we spoke. I feel enlightened on this new movement in Alberta, which I'm really hoping and praying that this.
I want to say one more thing about Breggin. He actually called me to interview me, and we had the long, interview before the interview. He didn't like what I told him, and guess what? I was never interviewed. He doesn't want to hear the other side of the story. Interesting.
So you when you look at the World Economic Forum, you don't feel that they have any massive agenda?
Oh, of course they do. They said so. It's explicit. You learn nothing and be happy. They're closet communists, or fascists, or some miraculous mix of the two. Aided and abetted by billionaires who think they can control the world for their own ends. The principal funders of the World Economic Forum are billionaires.
Yes. So where is it that you deviate from what Peter Brengan is saying?
I'm not a conspiracy theorist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's his big thing. No, this was an accidental release. No one could have at all predicted the reactions to it or the consequences of it. It was a Machiavellian immediate exploitation of a totally unexpected opportunity for which the World Economic Forum and the Democrats in the States were amply prepared to take advantage of.
So the simulation in October 2019, hosted by the WHO and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, you think that's just a coincidence?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. This was not planned. There's a huge difference between wishing something to happen and actually being the instigator of making it happen.
Yeah, yeah. So
synchronous with their desire, there was an unexpected opportunity that dropped in their laps, mm-hmm. and they were meticulously prepared to take immediate advantage of it.
Now, what about the military gains? You heard the reports that a third of our military team that went to Wuhan came home deathly ill.
Sure, that was
those reports are out there. So, and you have military from all over the world being dispersed.
Sure.
They all just happened to be in Wuhan in October, November 2019. Yep. Do you not think that that's plausible that something happened there?
No, you'd have to assume that it was intentionally released. That's just a coincidence, in my opinion, of which that doesn't prove causation at all.
No. So you think you do not think there's any malicious intent here. It was accidental, but they've capitalized on it.
With brutal efficiency.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they've been very efficient. That we do agree. Well, Dr. Roger Hodkinson, this has been a fascinating conversation, a lively one, very informative. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, we'll do it again sometime.
I'll let you get back to your Saturday and your guests. Thank you again.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you. Okay. Each with their own dozen volunteers.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there are chapters within this movement. Tell me again, what would be your parting words for Canadians at this juncture? What do Canadians need to do?
They need to turn the flag upside down and sit down for the national anthem, reflect upon what's happening, and understand that there is a better way, but that will not happen unless they get off their duffs and actually stand up, take the risk, and be part of this process of recreating democracy. It's within our grasp. There are more of us than them. We're practical, honest, caring people who know what we want, and we're just not going to put up with this crap anymore. Mm-hmm. We are done. It's over. We're taking back control, and you lot that have been killing us had better watch out, because your day in court is coming.
Very interesting. Dr. Roger Hodkinson, those are some inspirational words. Interestingly, I spoke to someone who does circulate in these circles with the elite, and I don't know if you've heard what they refer to us as, because I didn't know what term they had coined to describe us. And you may not have heard this, but apparently they call us the discontents. And I asked this person who hobnobs with this group, I said, so do they respect us because we figured out their plan and their agenda? And he said, no, they fear us. And that fits with what you're saying. We have had enough.
Right. Well, you remember that famous quote that was misattributed to Gandhi. First they laugh at you. No, first they ignore you. Then they laugh at you. Then they attack you. And then you win.
Yeah. So we need
when you're getting flack, you know you're over the target.
Absolutely. And that's where we are right now. So thank you so much for your time, Dr. Roger Hodkinson. I do believe that your words will inspire many, and we need to mobilize.
You know what this means? This is Churchill's victory sign. You don't hold it this way around. It means something rather different in Europe. Victory. It's ours for the taking. Let's grasp it.
Thank you. So we are back with Dr. Roger Hodkinson, and we're going to talk about fertility, the vaccine and fertility. Go ahead. Tell us what you know on this subject.
Well, there are many facets to this, both in terms of the facts that are becoming available, but also medical research on how this could all be happening. And I'll start with the ending in order to get your attention. You think infertility is a problem? What about sterility? I'm not talking about genocide here of an intentional nature. I'm talking about these buffoons who didn't think through some of the horrible consequences that could happen, that need to be investigated because of the seriousness of the risk. So that's the ending. Let me give you the middle part of what I want to say. We know that fertility rates are dropping internationally, significantly. The numbers are hard to confirm, but it's definitely there. Mm-hmm. It's a matter of how bad is it. Mm-hmm. We know also that the clot shot, this experimental vaccine, gene therapy is a better description for it, has resulted in a 15% reduction in the concentration of spermatozoa in semen. That appears to be continuing for a couple of months after vaccination, so-called, but would be likely repeated after further doses of booster shots. Now, that drop in concentration of spermatozoa is superimposed upon a reduction in that count over the last 2 decades internationally, which is unexplained, an additional impairment of fertility. And remember too, that is simply the count. It does not reflect the functionality, the physiology of an individual spermatozoan's ability to fertilize an ovum. It's simply the number. We know nothing about the function, which is a different story entirely. So the ova come down from the ovary in the fallopian tube, and they're fertilized in the fallopian tube by a spermatozoan. And then they enter the cavity of the uterus looking for a hospitable environment to implant. As a pathologist, I can tell you, having opened up hundreds of uteruses, gynecologists don't do that. They pass the specimen to a pathologist to look at for the pathology that's going on. The endometrium, the normal endometrium, is the lushest, most fragile tissue in the entire human body. It's meant to be that way, as a welcoming environment for the fertilized ovum. You can put your finger in it, just like you can put your finger in the brain, a fresh brain. Very, very fragile tissue. And it's meant, as I said, meant to be so as a welcoming environment. But you know it's fragile as a woman because there's a menstrual period every month. It's refreshed to be constantly available for that ovum. The blood vessels in the endometrium that we see under the microscope as pathologists are the most fragile in the human body, extremely thin-walled, meant to exude nutrients, meant to be welcoming for that implanting fertilized ovum. So that's the normal state of affairs. Now, every single one of those blood vessels in the endometrium is lined by a specific receptor for the spike protein. It's called the ACE2 receptor. And when the spike protein attaches to those receptors, on the lining of those blood vessels, lining the uterus, it produces devastation. You get holes in the vessels, you get blood clots, you get bleeding. That's the attack of the spike protein on the ACE2 receptor. And that's happening throughout the body. That's why people are getting strokes and deep vein thromboses and heart attacks as well. But we're talking here about just the focus on the endometrium, the lining of the uterus. So it's no longer a welcoming environment. It's devastation. And so it's hardly surprising that those fertilized ova do not take. Net result, a reduction in the number of live births. Okay, it gets much worse than that. We know from the Freedom of Information Act that bar and bridle extracted from the Japanese authorities for the Pfizer data. The Pfizer submitted data to the Japanese authorities that was kept hidden. We do know that in those experiments, which involved just rats, that the nanoparticles, naked nanoparticles, there was no mRNA in them, just the nanoparticles themselves, which, by the way, are known to be inflammatory and intentionally inflammatory in order to encourage an immune response because of the nature of the surface of those nanoparticles. We do know from those experiments that those nanoparticles located heavily and selectively in the rat ovaries. Despite that information being privy to the FDA, no human research was done on the attack of the spike protein on the human ovary. No. It's being injected into pregnant women as we speak. So, connect the dots for me. This is simply something that could be happening, of profound importance, that demands immediate investigation because of the significance of it for the viability of the human race. Pregnant women are being injected with an unknown, an experimental substance that produces spike protein that we know gets through the placental barrier because of the size of the nanoparticles, and we know that nanoparticles of similar size, inert particles like silica, get through the placental barrier. Baby girls are born with all the eggs they're ever going to have in their entire life. It's about 1 million. When they're born, they don't continue making ova, eggs. It's finished. A very precious number of there at birth, and you don't have any more. So I hope you can see where I'm going with this. We have an intentionally inflammatory agent being given to pregnant women that will pass through the placental barrier, excuse me, and attack the developing ovary in a female fetus. Potentially attack, all subject to very urgent, necessary research. Because it could be, I don't know, that's why I'm worried shitless. I don't know the scale of that attack, how total it would be, or partial, or maybe not at all, not in existence at all. But the mere fact that it could happen, and we're injecting women with something that could not just produce an infertile woman 20 years from now, but potentially a sterile woman 20 years from now. That should scare the jeebus out of everyone. I'm simply talking medical science here. I hope I'm wrong, obviously. I'm just saying the scale of that threat is much more than the ovum not finding a welcoming environment in the endometrium because it's being devastated. It's much more serious than that. There may be no ova coming down that fallopian tube. We just don't know.
We don't know. What about men? what is the research showing is the effect on men and sperm count and sperm fertility?
Yeah, you could look it up. There's some technical words here. Spermatogenesis, the way in which sperm is produced in the testes. Mm-hmm. The very place where that multiplication is taking place is nurtured by, you might say, nursery cells. Mm-hmm. They're called Leydig, Leydig, and Sertoli, Serloti. Leydig and Sertoli cells are the nursery cells for the developing spermatozoa. Mm-hmm. And Leydig and Sertoli cells have the ACE2 receptor, which is theoretically, again, not studied, theoretically the focus of attack for the spike protein. And do remember what I said. It's all that's being reported is simply the count, the naked count. Mm-hmm. We know nothing about the physiology of spermatozoa, how functional they are, how capable they are of fertilizing an ovum. We know nothing about that, simply the count.
Well, way back, about a year and a half ago, Dr. Stephen Key from Seattle was producing some reports that this is before the vaccine, but he said the COVID spike proteins were affecting sperm count and motility and shape of the sperm and rendering them rather useless. I mean, he said there was a 400% decline in numbers, and the shapes were very peculiar. The motility was off. And this is before the vaccine, but this was the nature of the spike protein damage on men. So I haven't heard much more from him or anyone else on that matter, but I think this is a catastrophic problem.
I don't believe that research has been replicated. There's certainly great interest in Israel on this matter. They're the ones that have been principally publishing. And by the way, talking about Israel, I'm not sure if you know, but one of the most prestigious researchers of the data from a statistical perspective is a Canadian PhD who lives in Israel, Dr. Jessica Rose. And if you want to Google her, she writes some incredible articles.
Yes, I have followed her. She is a wonderful source of very solid information. Yeah. It's interesting, the research that is being suppressed in Israel, but is still getting out. You know, they're trying.
Well, it's not just in Israel. People have to realize that progress in medicine really only happens because of published experimental data, research. Now, the major journals, particularly the New England Journal of Medicine and the Lancet, the British Medical Journal, the BMJ is the third one, but that's in a very different league. Very honest, very, very, very legit, not at all corrupt. But the New England Journal and the Lancet are utterly corrupt to the extent that they are in the back pocket of Big Pharma, because subjects that are researched and are negative to the narrative just miraculously don't get published.
Yeah.
So most of the stuff that gets published is in favor of whatever Big Pharma is saying.
Yeah.
The other side of the equation is not reported. And so that builds into the difficulty that we have now in medicine of believing anything that the CDC says. The CDC themselves are corrupted by funding from Big Pharma, getting 50% of their money from Big Pharma. It's like asking your child to mark their own homework, you know.
Yeah. Well, and you know that people like John Ioannidis out of Stanford has said repeatedly for years, I think back in 2005, he wrote a paper saying the scientific community is corrupted. And right. I think less than 10% of scientific papers are reproducible.
Right.
This is a massive problem. This is like the Titanic is sinking in the scientific world.
That's layered on top of the fact that most of the research that's done is garbage in the first place.
Yeah.
Because it's the paper mill in universities, as I said in the previous program.
Yeah.
That is the business of a university, not educating people at all. So no, you have
business. That is so true. It is the business, and they have their marching orders to produce papers that confirm the agenda.
That's right. That's right. So the whole edifice is corrupt, and you need to look no further than video testimony. Anyone can look it up, by a Dr. Rubin, Rubin, who was the top dog at the New England Journal of Medicine, the senior editor-in-chief.
Mm-hmm.
Top dog. When the FDA was debating whether or not to pass through the request by Pfizer for vaccination of children, he is on record, on video, watch him say these words to the effect that it may not be exactly what he said, but the meaning is what I'm going to tell you. He said essentially this, quote, "We won't know if it works until we use it." In other words, children being sacrificed on the high altar of these demigods, these technocrats, these corrupt American journals. Lancet in Britain is no different. But he actually said that publicly.
Yes, I heard that. And it's one thing to think it, but it's quite another to actually verbalize it.
And I think historical precedent should be relevant here.
Mm-hmm.
Child sacrifice for the Aztecs didn't make the rain fall. And it won't save Granny in the nursing home. What it will do is kill children. And each one of those children that are going to be killed with this vaccine is as precious to some family as my children are to me. They're not a statistic. They're a gruesome, grotesque consequence of corporate greed and political indifference.
I should ask you, do you have a faith? Because it's such a dark, we're in such dark times, and the consequences of all of this are rather grim. How do you reconcile what's going on? Or do you?
I am at the end of the day, as I said, optimistic about the future. Mm-hmm. When the revulsion sets in, mm-hmm. which isn't at a big enough level yet. Mm-hmm. But personally, I'm an agnostic. Mm-hmm. I was brought up a Methodist. Having said that, though, I want to make it very clear. I consider religious freedom, as traditionally understood, is the most important freedom. Mm-hmm. It's the oldest freedom. Mm-hmm. It has a belief structure that keeps many people going. Mm-hmm. We cannot undermine religious freedom. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Just a kilometer from where I live is Grace Life Church. Mm-hmm. I saw the fence going up. I was there when the police were there. I'm very aware, very, very aware of the importance of religious worship and the freedom to do so. Mm-hmm. And that's why, as I said in a previous episode with you, that the reluctance of the organized church to stand up and protect their flock at a time of great need is one of the most despicable abrogation of responsibility in the church's history. Yeah. It's much worse than the Pope having no interest in Nigerian girls being raped. Yeah. It's much worse than that.
It's horrific. And the whistleblowers are coming forward. You know, there are churches in BC who receive very large sums. I had heard that Trinity Baptist received $1 million to turn the church into a vaccine center.
Yeah.
That's deplorable. Sure. And yet and pastors being paid off to stay silent, right, or to close their church. So I think when all of this, you know, when all of this comes out, some heads should roll.
Most definitely. And after due process, they need their time in court. They're going to fight vigorously, try to wriggle off the hook. But remember, after Nuremberg, 7 so-called physicians swung. the scale of death
Yeah.
that's been going on internationally. I'm not minimizing what happened in those concentration camps one bit, but what I'm saying is that the scale of death that these technocrats have inflicted on the world is it's orders of magnitude worse than anything that those doctors did in those concentration camps.
How grim do you think it's going to be? I mean, it's very hard to predict, but what do you foresee happening here? Because we've got 80% of the population in Canada is at least double vaxxed, or globally even. What do you foresee is happening? What do you think is going to be?
Well, you can't turn the clock back. One hopeful sign is that, at least in the States, only 5% of children to date have been vaccinated.
Yeah.
There seems to be a general reluctance of parents to inflict that on their children.
I find that interesting. They contemplate the decision so much more carefully when it's their children. Mm. And yet, if they had really thought about it, they could be leaving their children as orphans.
Correct.
Like, your life as a parent is as important as your child's in a different way. But parents did not wrap their head around this issue very carefully when they contemplated getting the jab themselves. It's heartbreaking when I think about that, because you could have a lot of parentless children.
Cumulatively, it's what I'm labeling the big kill. And it's not over because of the potential resurgence of cancer, because of the immune suppression that the gene therapy is creating.
Yes.
Remember that the immune system is there to do one thing, to identify things that aren't you.
Yeah.
One of which is bugs, infections. But the other thing is cancer. Cancer isn't you. Mm-hmm. And most people don't realize it, but every second of every day, your immune system is surveilling every single nook and cranny in your body, looking for those tiny cancers and knocking them off very efficiently, and so that you don't die of cancer until you're 85. That's going on silently with miraculous efficiency. Mm-hmm. And that's what this gene therapy has interfered with. It's suppressed the immune system in general. And therefore, that is the likely explanation, as well as other additional issues, mm-hmm. why we're seeing a surge in new cancer cases, mm-hmm. and cancers that were thought to be, quote, under control, suddenly getting out of control.
Yes.
I'm elaborating a little bit here, if I may, Marianne, about the mechanism for that. Mm-hmm. There used to be dogma in molecular biology. And I'm, as you might have read out initially, I'm the chairman of an American biotechnology company doing a lot of DNA sequencing. I know quite a bit about this. There was, until recently, dogma that the way DNA was translated into some effective, useful purpose in your cells was for the DNA as the blueprint to be translated into a product called RNA, mm-hmm. that was then the blueprint for making a particular protein, a three-step process that was one way, DNA to RNA to protein. We now know that that is wrong, that you can go the opposite direction. And we do know that this mRNA in the so-called vaccine, in a petri dish with a liver culture of human cells, we do know that that RNA can go upwards and be permanently transcribed, as we call it, into DNA. Mm-hmm. Now, we don't know where in the DNA it's inserting. Is it next to another gene that could promote a cancer or not? We don't know where it's inserting, if it's always in one place or if it's random. We don't know that. But we also know that the spike protein interferes with the quality assurance of copying of DNA. When a cell divides in your bone marrow or on your skin or anywhere, when a cell divides, the replication the copying of that DNA is not always perfect. There are mutations that take place. Mm-hmm. And there's a particular repair mechanism that monitors that to kill those cells that have that mistake. We know that the spike protein specifically interferes with that quality assurance checking, which is another way that cancer could be being caused by this gene therapy. So you roll it all together, and that's another very concerning consequence of the clot shot, not just thrombosis, deep vein thromboses, heart attacks, strokes, but also the effect, as I've said, on fertility, and also the serious risk of encouraging cancer in people that would not otherwise have developed it. And on top of all of that, the immune suppression resulting in an increased risk of infection in general, not just with COVID, mm-hmm. as we're now seeing, because on a prevalence, corrected for prevalence basis, meaning per 100,000 people, there's more COVID infection now in people who've received the gene therapy, corrected for prevalence per 100,000, a strict comparison, no messing around with statistics here. Mm-hmm. The vaccinated are coming down with more infections than the unvaccinated. Now, that's not exactly how a so-called vaccine is supposed to work. It's going in exactly the opposite direction.
But this data is not getting out in mainstream media. There's still the misconception that we are the sicker ones, we are dying, the unvaccinated. And that battling the media narrative is almost impossible.
No, it will not be possible to ignore the carnage when the basement printing press gets going in the next year. Mm-hmm. Investigative journalists are going to be on this and will be educating people in ways that social media and the Alberta Prosperity Project don't come close. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying very candidly, watch out for the scale of revulsion.
Yeah.
The scale of revulsion.
I agree. The rage that people will feel when they recognize the magnitude of what has happened here.
Let me end with a straw poll that I did mm-hmm. a year or so ago until I was tired of asking the question. And this is how bad it is when you need straw polls to try to figure out what's happening instead of government really latching on and saying, we're going to figure this out. Mm-hmm. I asked this question to 500 people at a time. Would everyone here who knows of someone shortly after vaccination with this gene therapy, anyone here who knows someone who shortly after vaccination is aware of that person having either a heart attack, a stroke, or a pulmonary embolus, not a sore arm and a headache, but something life-changing, mm-hmm. would you please put up your hand? I wasn't prepared for the reaction the first time I asked the question. I was gobsmacked. A third of the people there put up their hands. So I said, hey, listen, just stand up, look around, would you? Does that look like a rare event to you? Mm-hmm. So I asked the question again on 2 further occasions, same number of people, and I got approximately the same ratio of hands going up. Isn't it sickening that something of that scale, that those were not deaths, by the way, those were people who didn't die, right? Mm-hmm. Well, some of them might well have died. But isn't it despicable that our so-called government and medical officers of health are turning a blind eye to something that's so rampant?
Yeah.
And you rely upon straw polls until, of course, Ed Dowd went public with the life insurance company in Idaho, showing a 40% increase in non-COVID deaths, not due to infection with COVID, in people who are almost overwhelmingly vaccinated because of the nature of group policies, meaning it's a large corporation that's undertaking it. And that was the first, if you like, I hate to use a pun here, but it's dead people. It was the first stone cold fact that emerged, other than the likes of my straw polls. Incontrovertible fact.
Exactly. And his most recent data that came out this week shows that the actuarial charts were revealing that the group of 25 to 45-year-olds, the death rate has doubled. 200%.
Excess mortality.
Excess mortality. I mean, this should be front page news.
All these strands of information are saying exactly the same thing.
Yes.
This is the biggest catastrophe in medical history.
Yes.
It's a gigantic screw up.
So how can we penetrate the wall with fellow Canadians, family members, friends who are calling us conspiracy theorists? What is it going to take for them to wake up? Because I don't feel the wake up is happening fast enough. What do you think we need to do differently? I
think the stats need to be more widely distributed, as I said. Sadly, it's my dearest hope that these children that are going to be sacrificed do not die in vain, that it sensitizes people to the gravity of what's going on. Dear children who were perfectly healthy, as dear to them as mine are to me, dying totally without any protection or need whatsoever, just being given an experimental agent to satisfy the political gods. I'm hoping that foments even more revulsion. It's got to get worse before it gets better.
Well, and maybe it has to be personal. You need to have death or serious injury within your inner circle for it to touch you personally, and then you can't escape it. Maybe, unfortunately, maybe this is what it's going to take. I
think so. It's tragic that
so tragic.
It hasn't been stopped in its tracks already.
Oh, that's been the most frustrating chapter of life to be, in.
And as a consequence of the loss of trust at every level in society, given the culpability of the CDC on this event, the natural question that has to be posed is, what else have they passed through with inadequate evidence? Potentially deaths having happened. What else have they hidden? And that cuts to the very core of so-called allopathic medicine, the use of medications to mitigate things.
Yeah, people are wary, suspicious, and I think a lot of people are looking back thinking, okay, what were the modes of healing in Europe before some of these characters came on the scene, like the Rockefellers? You feel as though the medical industry was hijacked, and they've been lying for a long time.
And that is for me as a physician, traditionally trained, it's a devastating moment in medical history to think that the organizations that we implicitly trusted. I was never an anti-vaxxer. I took vaccines of all sorts. I trusted them. They were blue chip,
We all did.
And now when that trust goes out of the window, you have to ask yourself, well, maybe Kennedy's right about autism and the triple vax. Maybe he's right. After all, I was an academic snot. I trashed him because the CDC said the opposite story.
Yeah.
But I'm eating humble pie now.
Did you see the research by Dr. Paul Thomas out of Oregon? He did a longitudinal study on his practice, And in Oregon, there's a lot of granola kind of crowd. So half of his practice, they did not vaccinate their children. So he has 20 years of data to compare the vaccinated group versus the unvaccinated. And in the unvaccinated group, there is zero autism, zero ADHD, zero autoimmune issues, asthma. It goes on and on. The healthy children are unvaccinated.
Yeah.
I wish I knew that. I vaccinated my children with the childhood vaccine schedule, but I reflect back now and I think we didn't listen to Dr. Wakefield. We weren't listening to the voices standing on the mountaintop. And that includes Robert Kennedy.
I'm not a well-read person at all, but I did come across a quote by Voltaire some time ago that goes like this. The art of medicine lies in amusing the patient while nature cures the disease. Now, that is prescient. That speaks to the incredible, at that time, the totally unknown capabilities of the body to fight off infection and cancer and all that. Yeah. He was way ahead of his time.
Way. The sophistication of our bodies and our immune systems.
Which we're messing with in a way that is totally unknown, a vital element in our survival against being killed by bugs and being killed by cancer. We're messing with that in ways that are totally unquantified.
Yeah. And as we started this conversation on the topic of sterility, I think you bring up a very valid point. I saw stats yesterday out of Germany that their birth rate is down over 20%.
Yeah.
Well, how do you account for that?
Let me put a little bit of humor in this for a change, because it's a pretty grim picture.
It is pretty dark. Yes, I agree.
You might have imagined, that being quarantined and stuck at home with nothing much to do might just have resulted in the opposite.
Well, that's right. During every blackout, during every snowstorm, there's always been a baby boom.
And it didn't happen.
Not this time.
It didn't happen, did it?
No. It's very sinister what we're seeing unravel before us. But just briefly, can you rattle off in point form the titles that you've had, just so that people understand how credible a resource you are? No. You've done so many things. Can you just list them?
All right. Well, my degree, I was second in the country in zoology in Britain. I got a scholarship to Cambridge, just not an ordinary entry. I was a scholar at Cambridge. I did my pathology training in Vancouver, which was an excellent training, the best in the country. By far. In the mock exam, to change from a written exam to a multiple choice, a fellow resident and myself came in top in the country, despite the fact that staff men, consultants were also forced to take it, and we beat them. Since then, I was an assistant professor at the University of Alberta, doing a lot of teaching with residents. I became the president of the Provincial Society of Pathologists. I became eventually the chairman of a Royal College examination committee in Ottawa in general pathology, setting the annual examination for pathology residents to make sure they were safe to be let loose on the general public. I'm chairman of an American biotechnology company doing extremely exciting work in commercializing, not research, commercializing DNA sequencing in a very, very original way. I've been president of the world's oldest Sir Winston Spencer Churchill Society, which happens to be in Edmonton, believe it or not, the only one blessed by Churchill in his lifetime. I was the honorary chairman of Action on Smoking and Health for 20 years, taking on the predatory marketing practices of big tobacco, in which we achieved modest success. Certainly not me. A dozen or so people across the country were very much involved in that, especially Gar Mahood out of Toronto, who got the Order of Canada for his work. I've done a lot of stuff. I was made Citizen of the Year for that. I've started a fencing club. I've done a lot of stuff, and I know on the board of advisory board of Taking Back Our Freedoms in Calgary, the organization headed up by Brian Petford, a national organization, which I'm very proud to be part of. I consider Brian a close friend.
Is Brian Petford involved in the Alberta Prosperity Project at all? No. But is he endorsing it?
I haven't spoken to him about that. He still, of course, is a fervent patriot for good reason. Mm-hmm. He signed last living signature on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and he's a passionate Canadian. Yes. But I believe he's also a pragmatic man. And as the dust settles, I can't predict what his opinion might be.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, you know what? You are a wonderful resource because you have a very broad list of, the experience that you have is very, very well, cool. So I think that,
I've done just about everything that a senior pathologist could be expected to do. I've done hundreds of autopsies at the medical examiner's office, so I can speak to sudden adult death syndrome. When I was there, it was exquisitely rare to sign out a death certificate as unknown cause. Exquisitely rare. It virtually never happened. There was always some reason for death, So yeah, I've covered the waterfront and Oda is also well grounded in medicine, quite apart from my brutal training in Britain. I was a GP in Britain for a year and also in British Columbia before I started my residency. So I'm acutely aware of the difficulties of being a good GP. It's the most difficult job in medicine. And I was in the trenches. I've seen that up close and personal. And I'm not an academic snot about GPs. I revere them for being the triage point for a lot of whining people.
That's so true. And if you're in a smaller community, they're doing everything. They have to be the specialist in a sense, out of necessity. One last question that I have for you is that the classification of unknown death. Now you say that's almost an unknown phenomenon in the world of pathology. These pathologists must know what is killing these people, but are they not allowed to define? It's in your mind, is it not the vaccine? Is it not a clotting spike protein?
Of course it's the vaccine. It's the
they're not. So what has happened that the pathologists are not allowed to designate the vaccine as causative?
Okay. Well,
have they been told shut up or we take you out? Or what's happening?
No, that's not the reason. The reason is performing an autopsy requires the permission of the family, or if there's homicide being considered, then that right is no longer there, and the state, the province, can determine that an autopsy will in fact take place. In the case of these sudden adult death syndromes, there's no suspicion of foul play. So there has to be permission by the family for the autopsy to occur. Now, given the gravity of what's going on, you'd like to think that the government would put in place some way of encouraging families to actually get an answer to what the death was due to. Of course, they don't want to know. That's the first point. The second point is that a good many of these sudden adult death syndromes are probably due to an attack of the spike protein on the heart conducting system, not myocarditis. Some of them may well be due to subclinical myocarditis that suddenly declares itself with a sudden death. But a good number of them may well be an attack not just on the muscle of the heart, but specifically on the conducting system of the heart.
Mm-hmm.
Now that requires very sophisticated staining, as we call it, immunofluorescent staining, looking for evidence of the spike protein in the vicinity of the conducting bundles in the heart. Now, that's a very sophisticated process that would only be developed if there's a large number of cases to do it on. It's happening in the States in a limited way. Ryan Cole, for example, has the ability to do it, and so is another pathologist in Germany. But you could easily imagine doing an autopsy on sudden adult death syndrome, and in an ordinary sense, in the way autopsies are usually done, and the sections that are usually taken, and the stains that are usually done and looked at under the microscope, you may well find nothing, unless you do very specialized investigations to look for where the spike protein is locating.
So the vast majority of these unknown deaths, there have not had autopsies.
No.
So
don't want to know, do you?
If I suspect foul play and I have a family member die, can I demand an autopsy because I suspect the vaccine has killed my family member? Can I not demand it?
No, you can try, but you're probably not going to get anywhere, because the places that are doing those autopsies are the hospitals and the medical examiner's office. And those facilities are under the financial control of the health ministry in the various provinces.
So they're blocking this. So could I demand an autopsy is done privately?
No, there's no access to private autopsies in Canada.
You're kidding.
No.
See, that to me is really important, that people have the ability to get the autopsy.
Sure. No, you're excuse me for using the vernacular, you're pissing up a wall. It would never happen.
It will not happen. In other words, you have no ability to prove the cause of death, and therefore you have no recourse.
No. Even if you wanted.
Isn't that handy? That's very handy.
They don't want to know at every level.
No, of course they don't want to know. But if you demand it, should we not be putting word out? If you suspect that your family member has died because of the clot shot, demand an autopsy with the pathologist, and you might get it.
Demand an autopsy with the medical examiner's office. That would be the location where it takes place, and have that in writing, and demand a response in writing.
Now, when you say with the medical examiner's office, is that a different avenue than a normal?
Yes, autopsies are performed basically in two locations. They're done they used to be, let me put it that way, in hospitals, basically as a quality assurance step for intraoperative deaths to make sure that the surgeon's not responsible. Mm-hmm. It was a quality assurance step. But very few autopsies are done in hospitals now because they're too expensive to run. Mm-hmm. And again, it's a failure of the quality assurance process. But the most, if not all, autopsies now are performed in the medical examiner's office or the coroner's office, depending on the province, where there are trained subspecialists in pathology called forensic pathologists, who are there to determine cause of death, typically where there's suspicious circumstances, homicides, and so on. And the other large category is what are called natural deaths in unnatural circumstances. So you find someone dead at home who'd had a history of heart disease, and they may or may not autopsy the body if foul play is not suspected. But it really is up to the individual family to bang the table, to demand that there be some resolution of this question of why did my dear husband die?
Yeah. Or my 30-year-old son or spouse.
Yeah.
So really, there is some power in Canadians demanding an autopsy. And
yes.
because, you
will get refused.
Suggesting that there is a criminal dementia here.
Yeah. You will get refused. I can guarantee you, you will get refused.
So how do you make it happen?
But have it written.
Yes.
And you could attach to that even a notice of liability, which is publicly available in the internet, letting them know that their decision not to do that could make them liable to future prosecution. That might get their attention, but I doubt it. They're going to stand behind the barrier of bureaucracy, and their defense would be, well, we got no money. The ministry said we shouldn't do it. We're already underfunded. We have to make these pragmatic decisions, et cetera, et cetera.
But even if I, as a family member, suggest that I will pay to do this, have you ever seen that where someone pays for an autopsy?
There's no mechanism of paying in the first place. They would just never agree to that arrangement at all. Let me paint a little anecdote here for the other side of that coin. Quite apart from, solving this enigma of why are all these people dying unexpectedly, as the commonest cause of death in Alberta now. I mean, how gross can this be, right? Commoner than strokes and all the usual causes of death as a single entity. I mean, but let me tell you something that happened about a year ago. I was called by, I can't mention his name, but a prominent politician who said that the president of their constituency association had just lost a 5-day-old child. And the child was autopsied. And this was on a Friday, by the way. And the routine practice now of any body being autopsied is to have a COVID test done on the body to see if it's positive or not. And this baby, this 5-day-old baby, was positive for the PCR test. And so, guess what was planned? The medical officer of health of Alberta was planning to do a news conference, basically bragging that Alberta was the first case of a pediatric death from COVID. It was planned. The news conference was planned. So I called the chief medical examiner and I told him who I was. I've worked there. I know I'm a pathologist. What did you find? No, we didn't find anything. So I said to him, listen, you know, and I know, don't we, that this was a SIDS death. This was a false positive PCR result. You found nothing at autopsy to support an infection being due to COVID. You know, and I know, don't we, that this was not COVID. This was a SIDS death. Are you going to tell the ministry that? Oh no, we can't do that. No, we can't do that. So I phoned the ministry. And I got online a woman who was obviously from Southeast Asia, who could barely articulate what she was saying. And I was repeating my same concerns about this being a very inappropriate news conference because the evidence just wasn't there. And guess what happened? Halfway through the conversation, a male voice appears out of nowhere. He'd been monitoring the conversation. I said, who the hell are you? Oh, I'm Dr. X, specialist in public health. So I repeated my statement. I said, listen, I just want you to know from me directly now, listen very carefully. You know and I know this was not a Sid's death. And if you go public with that news conference, I'm going to tear you to shreds. Tell the minister that. They didn't hold a news conference. They were looking for bravado, you know. We're the first province to have, the first place on earth to have a baby die of COVID.
Baby die of COVID.
Just to fan the flames of fear, you know.
Out of curiosity, was the mother vaccinated?
I don't know the details.
Be very interesting because there seems to be a very high, you know, death rate with that.
I mean, that was just a little anecdote.
That is fascinating.
You know,
so there is a perfect example of you flexing your muscles a little bit and changing the course of history.
Well, you know, it was just intended to add to the fear.
Exactly.
And that, of course, was the principal psychological strategy to get people to comply, was create the fear that this is a terrible disease. It's going to kill, you know, millions of people. And we've got to take these drastic actions now in order to protect you because we are the savior of humanity. You can trust us to protect you from everything.
Yeah.
Including, you know, driving to work and not getting a head-on collision.
Exactly. You've kind of piqued my interest with that SIDS. Okay, so it's a SIDS death. We don't know if the mother was vaccinated or wasn't. But I was reflecting back on all the SIDS deaths when my children were younger. And I think, were these caused by the vaccines, the childhood vaccines? I mean, now we don't know.
Typically, they don't get them, you know, within days of birth, you know.
They do in the US.
Yeah, in the US, I know.
They give them.
No, I think the cause is still largely unknown.
I can't help but wonder, you know, we don't trust anymore.
Well,
we've lost
exactly everything is on the table.
Everything's on the table.
Yep.
Well, you know, fascinating. Dr. Roger Hodkinson, thank you again for chatting.
My pleasure.
Absolutely fascinating conversation. And I just thank you for your time.
Well, we'll do it again sometime.
Yes,
thank you.
Go and enjoy your Saturday and your guests. Sorry to interrupt that.
Bye-bye.